It is October 1192, and in the rapidly cooling waters of the eastern Mediterranean, Richard, King of England and the Angevin Empire, has found himself with the status of a fugitive instead of a monarch. A 3-year truce with Saladin signed, he must needs return to the realm and protect it against those who would steal what is rightfully his. Painfully, Richard has heard that among these covetors stands his own brother, John. His ship arriving at the island of Corfu, Richard, who has not lost a battle since embarking on his crusade so many years before, comes to a sobering realization. His enemies are not only an upstart brother and the king of the French. Richard's high-handed march and voyage across Europe to the Orient has brought him many enemies. In fact, every route by sea or land is carefully watched for the advent of the man they call Cœur de Lion, and nowhere is safe. Not only has Richard rejected Philippe of France's sister's hand in marriage, but there were also grave rumors that he is somehow connected with the assassination of Conrad of Montferrat, whose election to the kingship of Jerusalem Richard had opposed. From Corfu, Richard takes the option to travel incognito, moving with just 4 attendants, passing themselves off as returning Templar knights, sailing up the Adriatic to make for the lands of his brother-in-law, Henry the Lion of Saxony and Bavaria, the one friend on the continent that remains to the king. But the winter sea crashes their ship at Istria, and after an attempt to maintain his disguise over land, Richard is captured after a 3-day ride by the forces of Leopold of Austria. At Acre, Richard had personally flung Leopold's standard from the wall into the dirt, and now the German has his opportunity for revenge. Leopold holds Richard for months while searches and investigations are frantically carried out by the Angevin authorities, and in March, the king is transferred to the custody of the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry. While Richard finds himself with little to do other than write verse, the empire hard won and maintained by his own arms and those of his ancestors faces dangerous predators from within and without. Life today is not as dangerous as it was in medieval and ancient times, but we may be living in what feels like the most anxiety-inducing era ever. At the start of a new year, it's all too easy to get overwhelmed by uncertainty and unpredictability in today's confusing world. That's why I'm an advocate for controlling what you can actually control, your mental health. With today's paid partner, BetterHelp, you can get help that is better. BetterHelp is professional therapy done with a credentialed therapist online. Their service can quickly assess your needs and match you for weekly video or phone sessions with a therapist that's best for you. You can also log into your account at any time to message them, which is very convenient for communication in between sessions. And you can change your therapist at any time for free. Don't sit in a waiting room. Don't get stuck with the only therapist in your area. Don't pay any more than you have to. If there's something in the way of achieving your goals in 2026, try going to betterhelp.com/historymarsh or click the link in the description and get 10% off your first month of therapy. Richard's brother John wastes no time on hearing word of the king's capture before he rushes to the court of Philippe of France and swears his fealty. In January, barely a month after Richard's capture the previous Christmas, John gives his loyalty to Philippe for Richard's lands in France and even promises to marry Philippe's sister Alice, whom Richard had cast aside. In England, while Philippe prepares to overrun large swathes of Normandy, most notably the great and important fortress of Gisors, John attempts to rally proponents to his side, but his mother Eleanor of Aquitaine, working in league with Walter of Coutances, both sees to the island's defense and the return of the king. Nevertheless, some great fortresses like that of Nottingham and Tick Hill are in John's hands. To raise the enormous ransom demanded by the Emperor, Eleanor must introduce a crushing income tax at the mind-boggling rate of 25%. Englishmen everywhere cry out that no free people should be subject to such an oppressive and suffocating burden, especially on money they earn with the sweat of their backs. Back in France, Philippe has allied himself with Baldwin of Flanders, who is also disgruntled at Richard, and for a time, a French invasion across the Channel is a real fear in England. Added to this are the machinations of Raymond of Toulouse, who threatens the borders of Eleanor's home region of Aquitaine. With the onset of the campaign season, Philippe targets Gisors, moving there with a strong force and the claim that the territory was only given to Richard as part of the dowry for the now abandoned marriage to Alice. Gisors is known by all to be one of the greatest structures in the entirety of France, and its octagonal wall, surrounded by a cylindrical keep and stone moat, bristles with heavy defences. Its base overlooking the meeting of the three rivers, Epte, Troezen and Révillon, gives it an unparalleled command of the region, and Philippe's army sets out as though it will put the castle to siege. But its governor, Gilbert de Vascoy, submits and transfers the bastion to the French king in a suspiciously rapid space of time. The cries of treachery are universal from those who are loyal to Richard. With Normandy's foremost bulwark in his grasp, Philippe moves through the duchy proper, his army incendiaries burning anything that cannot supply or turn a profit, and taking hostages in multitudes. The Vexin region, another gift from Philippe to Richard, is occupied. Philippe's army reaching Dieppe and then marching directly south to put Rouen, Richard's ancestral Norman capital, to the siege. The forces of Baldwin of Flanders join him in this fight. Up until this point, Philippe has been virtually unopposed in his seizure, but Robert de Beaumont, Earl of Leicester, a veteran of Richard's crusade to the east, puts up a stiff resistance, taunting Philippe to make an all-out assault on the city. Unwilling to embark on such a gamble, and seemingly unable to carry out a long siege, Philippe withdraws his forces and patches up a ceasefire with Richard's emissaries at Mantes in the second week of July. Philippe now effectively controls all of Normandy east of the Seine, and John is thrown a bone with command of the town of Iveroux. Richard's representatives agree that the status quo will remain until the king's return, in which case Philippe says that Richard can pay him homage and perhaps have some kind of territorial return. In secret, however, both John and Philippe attempt to have Richard kept in captivity, with bribes to the Emperor Henry. Their plots fail, as Richard has impressed the imperial nobles with his bearing and speech at a trial Henry put him to the previous spring. Eventually, England beggars itself and raises Richard's ransom, releasing him in the early months of 1194. "Look to yourself," Philippe writes to John in a stark warning. "The devil is loose." The same devil lands at Sandwich on the very edge of Kent that March, and his return to England is a rapturous affair. A month later, Richard appears before the populace at Winchester Cathedral in the finest robes and with his crown glittering in glory, an effective second coronation being held to expunge the ignominy of his captivity. All present speak at length of Richard's actions already in the few weeks since he stepped foot on English soil. Nottingham and Tick Hill have been besieged and ripped from John's control, along with numerous other considerable estates. At the same time, those who have betrayed the monarch at his time of mortal peril and danger are hanged until dead. Richard has no time for weak traitors. Before leaving for France, Richard appoints Hubert Walter, another loyal liegeman from the Crusade and already Archbishop of Canterbury, to run England's government in his absence. Walter's skill in assisting Eleanor to raise Richard's mammoth ransom has put him in fine stead with the king, and his elevation affords Richard confidence for the fight to come. In the second week of May, Richard sails for France at the head of an armada that many say contains 300 ships. Landing at Bartlett, Richard is greeted almost immediately by John, who flings himself down into the earth and prostrates himself before his brother, begging for forgiveness. To the surprise of many, Richard tenderly picks him up in a hug, saying, "Have no fear. You are a child, and you have had bad men looking after you. Those who gave you bad advice will get their deserts." But the damage done to Richard's holdings is considerable. Along with Gisors and Vexin, Richard sees that western Normandy is lost, particularly the coastal regions of Arc and Cœur. The loss of Dieppe is near total, and John has even given away fortresses in Touraine and Angoulême in Aquitaine. Luckily for Richard, his brother-in-law Sancho of Navarre has ridden to protect the far greater part of his holdings from Raymond of Toulouse. But even Brittany is wavering and sitting in Philippe of France's camp now. To try and make up for the betrayal, John returns to Évreux and slaughters the French garrison he had been provided by the French king. Then Richard sets to work. After quickly consolidating his return at Rouen, he moves to Verneuil, where Philip has the town under siege. Richard's army rides directly at the French king's host, reinforcing the town and also threatening to besiege the besiegers. At this time, Richard's army is made up of heavy cavalry, spearmen and crossbowmen, drawn from across his realms and from mercenary companies further afield. It is a potent force, with more men coming from the French regions of Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, and Gascony than England. Probably no more than 12,000 operatives in total, Richard relies on speed and siege rather than open battle. Philippe, hearing at this moment that John has massacred his men at Évreux, leaves Verneuil and rides to avenge this insult. He orders a significant force to remain and continue the siege, but the following day this detachment also decides to withdraw, with the threat of Richard's army behind them, leaving all of their artillery. Richard happily takes this and moves further south toward Tours and the Loire Valley, while Philippe must content himself with burning Évreux for its betrayal and ravaging the lands around Rouen. This done, he sets off in pursuit of Richard. By the time Philippe arrives, Richard has taken Tours and a sizable payment from its authorities, then moved to assist the Navarrese siege at Loches, which he takes by storm almost immediately, and then stamps his overlordship on Touraine. From there, he moves to put Vendôme to the siege. Here, Philippe puts his own army behind that of Richard in the first week of July, and tells his men that he will attack on the very next morning. The dawn, however, reveals a French king and a French army in full retreat, swiftly pursued by Richard and his army, his mercenary captain of some years' standing, Mercadier, providing him with constant fresh horses. Philippe escapes, but Richard whips into his rear guard at the Freteval wood, and the result is a disaster for the French monarchy. While the losses are minimal, the material captured by Richard is nothing short of incendiary. The entire royal baggage train is grabbed by the Angevins, who celebrate on a bounty of horses, tents, siege engines, and much of Philippe's treasure. Not only that, Richard takes the royal archives, giving him a complete insight into Philippe's life, court, income, military, and most importantly of all, his spies and the turncoat nobles who had gone over to his side. In the fortnight following, Richard's position is unassailable, taking Taillebourg, Marcillac, Angoulême, Châteauneuf-sur-Charente, and Montignac, among other lands, and by his own account, capturing perhaps 300 knights and 40,000 soldiers. Unsurprisingly, Philippe signs a truce on the 23rd of July in an attempt to stave off total disaster, and Richard looks to consolidate the retrieval of his territories. Philippe still holds significant amounts of land in vital Normandy, however, including Gisors. He also manages to snatch the baggage train of John, the king's brother, a slight revenge considering his own loss, but a victory nonetheless. Richard begins to look for a new fortress to lock his domains. He finds it at a high rocky outcrop looking over the town of Les Andelys and the slow rolling waters of the Seine. Richard completes a gigantic fortress at that point, naming it Castle Gaillard, or the Saucy Castle. Completely forbidden under the terms of his truce with Philippe, it replaces Guyot for the Angevins and provides a bulwark blocking the route into Normandy from Paris, defiantly standing sentinel and making it clear that Richard's rule in France is as solid as stone and rock. Both fortresses, Gaillard and Gisors, are now bases from which the cohorts of the kings can ride forth and instill dread in both their enemies and the common people alike. Unsurprisingly, war erupts almost immediately once more. The following two campaigns lack the urgency of the previous, but they are nevertheless dramatic and violent. When Philippe again puts Verneuil to the siege, Richard arrives for talks rather than a shock collision. But Philippe's orders that the sappers continue their work during the conference means that a wall collapses in full sight of Richard, while the combatants are supposed to be under a flag of truce. Philippe burns Dieppe, allegedly making use of Greek fire, then stirs up trouble for Richard in Brittany, and moves on to campaign and burn in the Berry region. At Issoudun, he believes that he has lured Richard into a trap, but the Angevin king turns the tables, and Philippe is forced to sign yet another truce that barely lasts the winter. The next year seems to go Philippe's way. First, Richard is injured by a crossbow bolt at Gaillon, which renders him unable to fight for at least a month. And then Philippe manages to take custody of Richard's most likely heir, Arthur of Brittany. With the boy safely smuggled into Paris, and a new agreement of peace and cooperation agreed by Raymond of Toulouse to boot, Philippe imagines that the future of Richard's realm now lies in the palm of his hand. But no sooner has Richard recovered his health than the sands shift below Philippe's feet, and by the end of 1197, a series of events brings the war decidedly into Richard's favour. An English boycott of Flanders works its power, and its Count Baldwin agrees to come onto Richard's side and attack Philippe. Next, the Emperor Henry dies, and those electors who had been so impressed by Richard during his captivity vote for his nephew Otto of Brunswick to take the imperial title. Suddenly, Philippe is facing the prospect of attack from both Flanders and the Rhineland. Gamely, Philippe's response is attack in turn. In 1198, he drives into the Vexin, burning and looting all before him. But Richard is ready and counterattacks, aided by Baldwin launching a Flemish assault in the Artois, By this time, after so many years of war in Europe and the Orient, both armies are showing cruelty unthinkable by the day's standards of chivalry. Those who are not killed, raped, or carried off from their burning homes count themselves lucky if their eyes are put out with a dagger or hot poker. It is a war of terror. Richard's counterattack sees him taking Courcelles-Chaussy and Bory before he rides back to Dangu, just 4 miles from Gisors. Somehow, when messengers arrive at Philippe's position, likely in Gisors or close by, they tell him that Courcelles-Chaussy is still at liberty, and its garrison are fighting hard against the enemy. Thinking that he has Richard unawares, Philippe rides at the head of several hundred knights and likely assorted infantry toward the town. Unbeknownst to him, the two forces are in such close proximity that Richard, who is patrolling the newly controlled area, hears of his presence and wastes no time in rushing for a confrontation. Philippe and his force arrive before the town of Courcelles and look askance on the scene. Richard's forces have reduced and occupied the settlement, and smoke pours from the neighborhood. Equipped for an assault at speed, and without the means to dig in and deploy artillery for a siege, Philippe has his host turn and prepare to withdraw. It is at that moment that the crossbow bolts begin to fly from concealed positions among the tree lines, and the first of Richard's riders become visible. Philippe, his senses already telling him that the situation is far worse than he thought at the outset of his relief effort, faces a terrible dilemma. Honor requires him to stand and fight, particularly in the face of another king. Richard's standards are likely now visible to the French, but his force of a couple of hundred men is too small and not adequately deployed to face another army in the field. Richard's slightly larger host, on the other hand, is flying down with focused determination, not only to smite the French from the field, but to lay their hands on their monarch's sworn enemy and bring him before the Lionheart. The French break, without offering anything in the way of a protracted fight, and any man without a horse is left to his own devices. The speed of Richard's charge and the advantage it has in comparison to the slower starting French makes itself immediately clear. Richard himself is able to unhorse 3 knights and take them, boasting later that he used a single lance for all. Philippe meanwhile has made for Gisors, which is one small stroke of luck, because Richard has placed the greater part of his company along the nearby points of the river Epte, in the thought that Philippe would take that route. For miles the two armies race, Philippe doing his utmost to avoid falling into the clutches of Richard, a fate that would bankrupt his kingdom and leave it vulnerable to predators everywhere. Any man whose horse slows or hits a divot is immediately surrounded and prevailed on to surrender. Others are merely killed on the spot, and skirmishes break out all along the route. Finally, blessedly, the French king sees the great fortress hove into view. With his loyal guard around him, he whips his horse onto the bridge across the river, Richard's second ambush coming to naught. Philippe's guard nears ever closer around him on the confines of the causeway, and scores more riders come up from behind. There are more ahead. Seeing that Philippe is going to make his destination, Richard and his army keep up the pressure from behind, intending to see out the chase to the bitter end. Then, the hand of God seems to reach down and put the future of France in peril. The bridge collapses under the weight of the knights, their horses, and all of their collective armor and weapons. Philippe is thrown into the river, and he lashes about while getting knocked back and forth by the steel forms of his knights and companions. Richard enjoys the show, mockingly regaling his own companions like Mercadier and William Marshal that Philippe is getting a good drink after his hard ride. For the French king, it is no laughing matter. He is swallowing water at an alarming rate, and his armor is weighing him down, making it impossible to claw to safety. On both sides of the river, and amid the debris of the ruined bridge, there is panic to try and rescue the monarch from certain death. Somehow, with a momentous effort, Philippe is pushed and hauled to the riverbank, gasping for air and shivering from the cold. With cover from the high battlements behind, he is hustled inside Gisors, and there he is left to rue the disaster and humiliation of the day, while the warmth and strength slowly returns to his body. The chase at Gisors is downplayed by French chroniclers, but there is little they can say to the numbers and to the indignities suffered by their king. Philippe has escaped with his life, but 20 fine knights drowned beside him. William Marshal records that 100 great men were taken prisoner, with several being of the highest caliber of fighting men. Fully 200 of the French knights lose their horses, with 140 of these animals clothed in finer armor than the majority of Richard's own men. For his part, Richard's prowess is reaffirmed following his heroics in taking several prisoners with his own hand, and he writes in letters of his giddy glee at watching Philippe drink from the river. After some more desultory raiding and skirmishing, a 5-year halt to hostilities is agreed when the two kings meet on the Seine in January 1199. Richard stands on the deck of a boat, while Philippe stands on the bank, and they hurl invective at one another. It is like old times, when the two went on crusade. For Richard's part, he has reconquered all of the lands taken from him while in captivity, and shown himself conclusively to be the better man. There are now only mopping up operations left to him, some easy campaigns in the south against the restless and insolent lords of Limoges and Angoulême. One castle there, Châlus, is said to be guarded by just 40 men. Richard looks forward to an easy spring in the prime of his life, refortifying his empire, and perhaps even beginning to make plans for a return to the Holy Land once the question of an heir is settled, and he has satisfied himself that the final cogs are in place. Everything, after all, is in God's hands. If you like what you see, consider supporting my work on Patreon, and you get ad-free early access to my videos for as little as $1. You can also show your support by liking the video, commenting, and subscribing to my channel as a sacrifice to the algorithm. As always, I'll see you in the next one.